be helpful to you in some way. We have some visitors with us too tonight. We're thankful that you're here. And if you have any questions about what was said or about what we're doing here, we love to answer those questions. So please ask. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Jeremiah 22. There's a few verses in here that I want to focus on. On Thursdays, me and Jason are studying Jeremiah together. And we have tried very, very hard not to make every sermon about whatever we studied in Jeremiah that Thursday. But every once in a while, a few slip through. And this is one that slipped through. Jeremiah 22:11-17, God's just making a comparison between two kings. But in my mind, it's fascinating the way God compares and contrasts these two kings. And I think there's something to glean from it that's worth a sermon time. It says this line that they have different goals of the eyes and the heart. And certainly, at least in my mind, it's a very clever way of saying it, that we all have ambitions and we all have goals. We all have things we want in this life. And our eyes and our hearts sometimes try to lead us to ambitions that God doesn't want us to have. But there's other times that the eyes and the hearts can be controlled and adjusted. And those eyes and that heart can lead us to better goals that would be more fitting of our God. So I want to read that passage. What I'd like to do is first explain the setting of where in the world we are when we read this passage. Then I want to read the passage and break it down. And then at the end, I just have some New Testament application, and the lesson will be yours. To put us in the setting before we do our reading, just think of the kings of Judah that are during the time of Jeremiah the prophet. And if you're like me, you think of kings in terms of frowny faces and smiley faces. Manasseh was a king before Jeremiah, but he was a king in Judah, and he was exceedingly wicked. So wicked that even that he repented at the end of his life, the people that he was king of never really came back. The society had been so weakened by the acts of Manasseh, and the idolatry became so rampant that God felt like he didn't have any control in Judah anymore. So when Manasseh is king, God pronounces Judah's destruction, that he's going to wipe them out, save a few captives, and he's going to basically start over. And that's the pronouncement of Manasseh. Manasseh repents, but he never turns the people back. But almost shockingly, Manasseh has this son named Josiah. And Josiah does the complete opposite. And many of us know the story of Josiah, especially for little kids. We're little kids Bible class. We remember being taught about Josiah, how he became king at a very young age. When he's a teenager, he's bored basically one night, and they find the book of the law and they read him the book of the law, the Bible basically. And when they read it to him, he realizes this is our God, this is our law, this is our book, and we haven't been doing any of these things. So Josiah begins reforms, and he begins to restore the law of Moses to the people of the land. And even though he tears down all that idolatry, and even though he tears down all those high places and makes all these big changes, Jeremiah becomes a prophet and he begins helping Josiah. He can't convince the everyday guy really to repent and come to the Lord. And so Josiah dies in an early age of his 40s. He's killed by Pharaoh's army, and he's gone. And it seems to be that the people were just waiting for Josiah to die so they could go back to the deeds of Manasseh and go back to the way things used to be before Josiah. Josiah has 3 sons that become king. The first one is Jehoahaz. And he only reigns for 3 months after Josiah dies, but he is wicked. And Pharaoh comes in, and the Pharaoh of Egypt removes Jehoahaz and takes him into captivity, replaces him with another one of Josiah's sons named Jehoiakim, who reigns for 11 years. And he is just as wicked as all of the rest of them, right? And eventually Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, comes in, and he removes Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim has a son named Jehoiachin. We don't know much about him, but he was there for a king for a very brief time in the time of Jeremiah. He's a kid, though. He doesn't do much. He just surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar. The only reason why Jehoiachin is really important is because he goes to Babylon, and he is the ancestor of Jesus. So this is how Jesus is connected to this family. When Jehoiachin is taken to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, then the last king of Josiah's sons becomes king named Zedekiah. And he doesn't change anything. And we know that he is just as bad as the rest of them. Why? Because he too has a frowny face. So Zedekiah doesn't help. We know the story how it ends. God destroys Jerusalem. He kills Zedekiah's sons before his eyes. Nebuchadnezzar does. And Zedekiah is blinded and taken to Babylon to die. And so what we're doing here in Jeremiah working with all of these kings except for Manasseh, God uses Jeremiah to make a comparison between these two men, Jehoahaz and his father Josiah. And God is basically saying, Jehoahaz, why can't things be like when your dad was king? Because your dad knew me, but you seem to not want to know me at all. Now here, look at verse 11, starting to read. Jeremiah calls Jehoahaz Shalom. Jeremiah has nicknames for the different kings, which frankly just makes it all that much harder. But this is Jehoahaz, and this is his nickname for him, Shalom. Verse 11, for thus says the Lord concerning Shalom, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, who reigned instead of Josiah his father, who went from this place. He shall not return here anymore, but he shall die in the place where they had led him captive, and shall see the land no more. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by injustice, who uses his neighbor's service without wages, and gives him nothing for his work, who says, I will build myself a wide house of spacious chambers, and cut out windows for it, paneling it with cedar, and painting it with vermilion. Shall you reign because you enclose yourself in cedar? Did not your father eat and drink, and do justice and righteousness? Then it was well with him. He judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well. Was not this knowing me, says the Lord? Yet your eyes and your heart are for nothing but for your covetousness, for shedding innocent blood and practicing oppression and violence. There's our little compare and contrast that God gives between Josiah and Shalom or Jehoahaz. What are obviously Jehoahaz's goals in this little section? And if you notice there, especially in verse 17, your eyes and your heart are for nothing but these things, right? Certainly Jehoahaz has ambitions in this life. He has things he wants to do, and let's look at the things that he accomplished. I'm going to skip the first thing that I think is the root of all of this, and it's in verse 17. But if we go at the beginning of the section, what was Jehoahaz consumed with? Well, if you look at verse 14, I think it gives a good idea. Jehoahaz wanted to build a big house. And most of this passage is about the big house that Jehoahaz was going to build, right? And he says, God's like, I know you got a big house. I know that you built it out of cedar. I know that you cut big windows out, right? And you think about these things that he's ambitious for. You don't have to look very far in America to find the same type of people that are ambitious for the same type of things. A big house with big windows, right? Because it seems like big windows mean money nowadays. They haven't always been that way, but it seems like now that's sort of what the thought means, and it must have meant the same thing for them. He not just wanted a build house, but he wanted to build a big house with fancy material, right? We see that he was going to bring cedars in. And if you remember when you've read the book of Kings and that sort of thing, where did they go to get the cedars? They went all the way to Lebanon, and even Solomon built the temple out of the cedars from Lebanon, right? Well, it seems like it's kind of the same thought, like, I've got the hardwood trees here, and this is my hardwood floors, and you better not bring your boots in this hardwood floors, right? But this is the fancy material. Not only that, but he was going to paint it with what in verse 14? He was going to paint it with vermilion, which is a fancy word for the color red. Y'all know when you go to the paint store, do they just say, oh, what kind of color you want? Do you get to just say, I want blue? Do you get to say, I just want red? No, what do you got to say? You got to say things like, I want midnight moon. And you look like a fool telling them what kind of color this named is. This is what the thought is, right? This is a fancy color. This is vermilion. And my understanding, too, is that it's expensive for Jehoahaz to paint his house with vermilion. So what is he showing off with this big paint and all these windows? Well, he's got money, right? And now he says he's king just because he has this fancy palace. And if this wasn't as strange enough, maybe the wickedness we really see is at the beginning, that he didn't want to just build a big house, but he wanted to build a big house for cheap by withholding others' wages. If you remember back in verse 13, woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness, who uses his neighbor's service without wages and gives him nothing for his work. The very end in verse 17 says that he practices oppression and violence, that he would hire men to build his palace, but then when it came to be payday, he wasn't interested in paying. Do you know people like that? I think all of us that are a little bit older, we know people like that they will hire you for a job, but they won't pay you for the job. And that's wrong. That's sin. From us that studied Leviticus, what did we learn from Leviticus about the old law? If you withheld a man's wages just for one day, you were in sin for that, right? That there was no weight on paying someone for the work that they had done, but Jehoahaz, he wanted to be cheap, and he withheld the proper righteousness of not paying people for the work that they had done. Well, why does Jehoahaz and all of his accomplishments, what was his goals of his eyes and his heart that led him to do these things? Is it not the beginning of verse 17? Yet your eyes and your heart are for nothing but your covetousness. And if me and Jason get up here and preach about covetous enough, we will eventually be able to pronounce it correctly. But Jehoahaz's goals in verse 17, God lets him know. Your eyes and your heart are for nothing but your own covetousness. What you can get out of this life, right? Not about what you can give, not about the way you can serve, not about how you can know the Lord. It's about what you can get out of this life. And that's why he built his big house without paying the workers that built his big house. Well, that's certainly the comparison that Jehoahaz has, but I think it becomes more interesting when we see what he says about Josiah, his father, in this passage. It seems to be, in my mind, that where Josiah's goals were, the goals of his eyes and his heart was not for covetousness, but it was because he wanted to know the Lord. It mentions about verse 16, about what he did to judge the cause of the poor and needy, then it was well. Why was he able to do that? Was it not this, knowing me, says the Lord? Why could Josiah go out and do these righteous things? Why could he restore Israel to the law of Moses? Why could he restore Israel to a brief moment of glory and greatness? Well, it was because, number one, he knew the Lord. He knew who God was. And because he knew who God was, he could have these ambitions that would help the Lord to restore Israel. And go ahead and just take it because we've already said it in verse 16. Because he knew the Lord, he was able to judge the cause of the poor and the needy. That he's not somebody who doesn't pay his workers. What is he instead? No, Josiah is the man that you go to when you don't get paid. And Josiah goes and he pleads the cause of the poor and the needy, the man who worked and didn't get paid. Josiah is worried about those that are not as fortunate as him, and he wants to use his position to help others, to love his neighbor as himself. Well, why can he do things like that? Well, because he knows who God is, and God's the one who judges the cause of the poor and the needy. We also see that he did justice and righteousness. We get that from verse 15. That, he did justice things. He was fair. He was good. He was righteous. And many of us that go to work every day and all week, isn't that what we're looking for? We're looking for some fairness and some righteousness in the workplace. And those of us that understand anything about our government, what are we looking for? We're looking just for a little bit more justice and a little bit more righteousness and fairness. Well, this is the type of man that Josiah was. And to the best of the ability, this is the type of government that he ran. Why? Because he knew the Lord, right? Not only that, we see that Josiah, he got to eat and drink, didn't he? And if we'll just read this again in verse 15. He says, shall you reign because you enclose yourself in cedar? Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? What's the thought that God's making to Jehoahaz? Is he not saying, look, Jehoahaz, you want to eat and drink. You want to enjoy the fruit of your labor. You want to be able to relax, right? You want to be able to have a full belly. But guess what? Your father got to do all of those things and still know me and do justice and righteousness. You don't have to cheat people for a full belly, do you? And I think that's the message that God's making to Jehoahaz. You don't have to sin to not have to go to bed hungry. But Jehoahaz doesn't understand that, right? God says, look, Josiah got to see some good things in this life, and yet he was still able to do these things. Why was Josiah able to do those things? Because he knew the Lord. And one more, that very end of verse 15. Then it was well with him. And if you look in the middle of verse 16, poor and needy, then it was well. Did Josiah have a good life? Now, I'll say Josiah's life ended short, but Josiah had a good life. And Josiah was able to accomplish some things in this life. Josiah got to live a full life, even though he died as young as he did. Why was he able to have this fulfillment and to have a full belly? Well, it was because he knew the Lord, right? So I think you see where I'm going with all this. If your eyes and your heart are on the Lord, are you going to be able to do these things? Yes, you are. But if your eyes and your heart are about covetousness, are you ever going to accomplish any of these things? No. You can't do these things unless you know the Lord. And I think that's a life up here on the screen, at least a Sunday night crowd. This is all something we aspire for and something that we want. When we teach these things, and I think especially the opportunities that us that are parents, get the opportunity to teach our children these things, we have a way of explaining it. And the way we usually explain it is not bad. And I think it's a way we should continue to explain it. And I'm going to put that up on the screen. But then I'm going to show maybe a better way. But even though I'm going to show this other way, please don't think I think this is wrong. I think this is biblically sound. But I'm going to show you a little issue with it. The way that we usually like to explain this concept, especially to our kids or our children about having good goals, we'll talk about things in terms of priorities. We want to say things like, God should be number one, and family should be number two, and friends should be number three, and work should be number four, and that's a good way to explain it. Even though we all believe that, we seem to start sneaking into this really in our heart. And so we'll say things with our mouths. We'll say things like, God's number one in my life, and family's number two. But the way we behave, sometimes we end up on the screen instead. What is the Christian's goals? Well, it's to look spiritually successful, right? I didn't say to be spiritually successful. I said to look spiritually successful. And our worry is not about our relationship with God as much as our worry is about our relationship with the brethren, and if the brethren think we're spiritually successful. And that ends up being God number one in our mind, when that's really not what we mean when we say that, right? We talk about having a large number at church to look successful. And don't get me wrong, getting to preach to a full building is encouraging. It's nice to know that people took out the time to sing and to study. That's wonderful. I'm not trying to put that down. But when the only goal is we measure success by number, well, there's groups out there that have 300 people. And there are groups out there that have 50. And some of those 50 groups know the Lord a whole lot better than the 300 group, right? Spiritually successful isn't necessarily by number. But that's what looks successful. So in our minds, that's number one for God. We just got to get people in the building. I got to sound smart in Bible class, right? If I'm going to speak, I better sound smart. This comes up with even more problems. And again, it's about looking spiritually successful. Look at my house of cedar, right? Look at my giant windows. Look, I'm smart in Bible class. It causes a host of problems. One is there's a lack of sincerity about what we're even saying when we comment in Bible class, when we're just trying to look it. Number two, we're scared to ask questions and we're scared to be wrong. And my problem is when I teach Bible class, unless you talk to me back, I have no idea where you're at. And it's okay to say something that's wrong, right? It was as long as we're sincere, and then we get to talk about it, we get to read about it, we get to correct it if we need to correct it. And then we all learn something. It's not a bad thing when someone says something wrong, or especially when someone asks a question, right? But my Christian goals, question mark, is like, I just got a goal of sounding smart, and that's how God's number one. This is my opinion, and like I always say with my opinions, you can throw them away in the trash can when you leave. But when we have a comment we want to say, and we got it out of a commentary, I don't think you need to say, hey, I got this from so-and-so's commentary, and it says this, this, this. When I'm teaching and y'all give me those comments, I don't know what to do with them. Because what I really think you're trying to say is, this is what I believe. I got this from somebody else, but I believe that this is the case about this passage. Y'all don't have to source anybody in this class. If you believe it, you can just say it. Skip the commentary. If you heard something from Andrew that you liked during a sermon, you don't have to say in Bible class, well, didn't Andrew want? No. If you believe it, now you believe it. You can just say, I think this. I believe this. I believe this passage is saying this. You know, what's that instead? That's speaking the truth in love. That's Ephesians, right? And that's the person that's not trying to sound smart or trying to say that they're well-read. It's just saying, these are things that I've acquired, these are things that I've learned, and I believe they're true, and I want to share them. And maybe that could be more of our objective. And you can throw that away if you want to, but I'll come and pick it up out of the trash because I think it's good. Christians want to eat and drink. They want to have full bellies, you know? And thinking about this, there are successful things we want in this world. We all want to make sure we're not in need. And I think that's appropriate to a degree. But it builds up to this thought. Many of us want to successfully serve two masters. And I think that's exactly where Jehoahaz was. If you know where I'm going, you know where I'm going. Let's go to Luke 16. In Luke 16, Jesus says this phrase. He tells the parable, well, sometimes we call the unjust steward or the shrewd steward. And the message of the parable, at least the main message, is just that if unrighteous people will try to take care of their eternal soul, well, then certainly righteous people would be ambitious to take care of their eternal soul with the resources that they have. In verse 10, this is what Jesus says. He says, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, you will commit to your trust to true riches. And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot serve two masters, right? Think a little broader than just money. I know Jesus' main example here is money, but just using more of Josiah and Jehoahaz, I want to think a little bit broader than just money. Sometimes Christians, including myself, get this mindset that I'm going to get the best of heaven and I'm going to get the best of Jesus, but also here on earth, I'm going to get the best of the world. And I'm going to ride the line, and I'm going to make those quick decisions when I need to just to keep Jesus happy, but I'm going to get it the much out of this world as I possibly can. The problem with that is Jesus just said you can't serve two masters. The other problem with that is John says that the world and Jesus hate each other. They don't sit in the room together. They don't like being together. And when you try to ride the line, you know what Jesus says? You're really just going to end up serving the world or serving yourself. And so we get in this trouble as Christians where we go, okay, well, I'm going to go to church enough. I'm going to, attend this Bible class just enough. I'm going to learn at least what I need to know about God, but I'm not going to study further than that. And then I'll spend the rest of my time trying to meet my financial goals, trying to meet my enjoyment goals, be sure that my kids get this, be sure that my kids get that, be sure that I better my life, and then I'll die and go to heaven. The problem is that your master has never been in heaven if you're living that life. Jesus is looking for disciples that are committed, that sure, they eat and drink like Josiah did, and they enjoy the fruits of their labor, but they've got one master. And that's what brings me back to this little model. We talk about using this, and I think this is a good thing to do, especially with younger people or when we're new and we're figuring things out. But we like to say, okay, well, God's number one, right? And what's number two? Family. Well, family's number two. Friends, some people put brethren in friends, some people put brethren in family. You make that decision, I don't care. They go, okay, well, friends is number three. And then work. Work is number four. And then five is, honestly, my five is my dog. You have your own 5. And I remember being taught this as a little kid, and I'm glad they taught it to me. It's a good way to explain priorities, right? And it's a good little way to make decisions as we're trying to start making decisions for the Lord. Okay, well, if God's number 1, that's good. But as I gotten older, this list stopped helping me the way it used to. Let me give you an example that breaks the model. Let's say you take care of your mom, and your mom's older. Your mom breaks her hip. Terrible. A lot of us have suffered in that way. Are you going to skip church to stay with your mom who's broken her hip? Many of us would say yes. If it's my shift to watch mom, I'm going to miss church so I can stay home and watch mom. Well, when you're only using this model, what did you just do? You just put number 2 over number 1. And the more we use this list, God becomes more like going to church. And that's the way we think of it, right? And then our little worldview gets confused. And when someone questions us about that, we don't know how to answer because God's supposed to be number 1 and family's supposed to be number 2. If you're driving to the building for Bible class and you see a teenager on the side of the road trying to change a tire and he or she obviously does not know what they're doing, are you going to roll down the window and say, "Good luck, sorry, you're number 3. And I'm headed to number 1. Hope you figure it out"? Or are disciples going to stop and help the person get where they need to be going and get them off the road, and then they're just going to head to Bible class late? Well, I think all of us that use common sense, we would do the latter. But what did that do? That messed up our little chain here. You just put number 3 over number 1. So if I can, using Jeremiah 22, I want to put a different model on the board. You remember how we did Josiah? How did he judge the cause of the poor and needy? Well, it's because he knew the Lord, right? How did he do righteousness and justice? Well, it was because he knew the Lord. Why did he even be able to eat and drink? And it was well, because he knew the Lord. What if instead, maybe a more accurate, even though this other one's still good, would be something like this? In service to God, God is my master. That he tells me what to do in terms of my service to him. When it comes to worship or learning about him or singing to him, he's the boss of that situation. What if I said bullet? In service to family, God is my master. And God dictates everything I do when it comes concerning my family. And what he says clearly about my family goes. When I'm dealing with things that I don't have clear passages for, I will use the attitudes I've learned from his scriptures to make the decisions I have to make about my family. What if we said, next bullet, in service to my friends, God is my master. Everything I do concerning my friends or my brethren, whoever it may be, God is the boss of that situation. And whatever he says, that's what I'm going to aspire to do. In service at work, God is my master. And in everything I'm doing, God's going to make the final say about what I do at work, right? Is there any loopholes or problems with that model? Is God not still number 1? But instead of looking at it vertically, you're sort of looking at it horizontally, right? Does this remind you of a passage in my service at work, God is my master? Does it not remind you of Colossians 3? Because that's basically what Paul's saying. Let's turn to Colossians 3. We know this passage about doing all things in the name of the Lord. We know this passage about working as if we're working for the Lord. Verse 22, bondservants. 3:22 says, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service or men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. Whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair. That's someone who pays their workers, right? Knowing that you also have a master in heaven. We don't look at this passage, especially when we get to verse 24, knowing that you serve the Lord Jesus Christ, or verse 23 in the middle, as to Lord and not to men. We don't get to this passage and argue, treat your boss like they're God. None of us say that when we explain this passage, right? Do not do whatever the boss says, treat him like God. That's not what Paul's saying. What Paul is saying and how we teach this is you work at work knowing that you have a bigger master that's watching you, right? That you do the things you have to do in this life knowing that there is a higher master that you are held accountable to. Is that not what we're saying for all four of these things? When we have to deal with these different things in our life, why don't we live in them knowing that we have a higher master? And I think that's what serving one master is. And in my mind, maybe that's a more mature understanding of this list that we usually do. And maybe in 10 years, I'll have even a more mature list. So you'll just have to wait and see. Let's talk about now the Christian goals, finally. This one doesn't have a question mark, it has an exclamation point. I think this is what we've really gleaned from Jeremiah 22 and these passages from the New Testament. Well, the Christian's goals should be just like Josiah's. Number one, it should be to know the Lord. If you're going to obey him, you got to know what he says. And we have to spend time trying to know who he is from his scriptures. When I know the Lord, then I can be spiritually successful. And it's not about looking spiritually successful. It's about actually being spiritually successful. That I've grown. I understand this more than I understood it yesterday. This thing that used to be a real problem for me is not near the problem that it used to be. I've grown some, right? I have these new problems that I didn't even know I had, but the Lord has revealed them to me through his word, and now I'm going to try to deal with these new things. That's spiritually growing. That's spiritually being truly successful. I have to do justice and righteousness. In a world that has no fairness, of course, Christians should be the few groups that is fair, that is just and righteous. And we just read it in Colossians 4:1, that these Christians that are masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, just like Josiah did what was just and what was fair, what was righteous. The Christian's goals is to learn to be content. Now, I could have put eat and drink on here, but I wanted to use more Paul language as we move forward. Look at Philippians 4. When you talk about contentment, you can go to the end of 1 Timothy, or you go to Philippians 4. We're going to go to Philippians 4. Just flip one book backwards. In Philippians 4, verse 11, Paul says, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When we read this passage, just like I talked about Colossians, how we teach the passage, we focus usually on verse 13, which is a good thing to focus on. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When we also look at this passage, we like to talk about the word content. And we explain the concept of contentment, that Paul had all he needed, and he was content with that. But tonight, what I want to do is I was focused on a different word that at least I have never focused on in this passage. For I have learned. That's what Paul says, verse 11. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. And if that isn't good enough, he says it again, right? Verse 11. Oh, I did this backwards, sorry. Verse 11, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Verse 12 in the middle, everywhere in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry. When people become Christians and they come out of water, are they content? If a Christian comes out of the water and they get offered a house full of cedar with big windows painted with vermilion, are they going to look at that after they come out of the water and say, I'm content? You keep that big house. We spend our entire lives trying to learn how to serve one master. So what does Paul say here? Paul also is an older man, right, in Philippians. In whatever state I am, I have learned to be content. Even Paul had to learn how to be content with the things that God had provided him. And I think we too need to learn to be content. And that's not just an on and off switch. That's an everyday decision that God's going to be the master of this situation. God's going to be the master of this situation. I trust that the Lord's going to help me and take care of me in this situation. That's a learning process. That's a growing process. Something that we can make progress at over time and something we should aspire to achieve. If I can know the Lord and I can be spiritually successful and I can do righteousness and justice and I can learn to be content, what have I done? Well, I have successfully served one master. And that's the ambition and the goal. So to use Jeremiah 22:17 one more time, what are the goals of your eyes and your heart? Well, I hope that the goals of your eyes and your heart is to serve our one master, because that's the thing that the Lord has asked us to aspire to. Thank you for your close attention. Hopefully that's something that we can chew on and eat for a while. To tie this a little bit to Jason's sermon this morning, those that want to aspire to serve as shepherds and to serve as deacons, what are their ambitions in life? Their ambitions are to serve one master, and that's what's led them to these things, right? And that should be obvious. And to speak of something that Jason said, and I think Alan said it as well in the announcements, and it's something I wish I could always convey, and maybe I don't do the best job of doing it. When shepherds shepherd, then deacons get to deacon. And when deacons get to serve deacon, well, then shepherds, they get to shepherd, right? And when you get to be a part of a group where shepherds are shepherding and deacons are deacons, guess what preachers get to do? Preachers get to preach. And I don't have to shepherd and I don't have to deacon in terms of that role of servitude. I know we're all servants. But I get to do the work that the group supports me to do. And when preachers get to preach and shepherds shepherd and deacons get to deacon, what do Christians get to do? Christians get to Christian. And it's to my benefit that I have shepherds and deacons helping me do that, right? And I don't have to worry about whether the lights are going to come on or they're going to turn off like they used to all the time. I don't have to worry about if the air conditioning is going to be on. I don't have to worry about if the bathrooms are going to work. When I get to come here, what do I get to worry about? I get to worry about worshiping God. And my goals of my eyes and my heart can get to just be on God. And our shepherds and our deacons make a lot of that possible. But certainly as all of us as Christians, if our eyes and our hearts are on the Lord, well, then we have assurances that we can be with our master for eternity. If there's anyone who'd like to obey the gospel this afternoon, why don't you come forward as we sing and as we sing.
Hear the sweet voice of Jesus say, come unto me, I